Making a dichotomous key. For this lab exercise, we're looking at ways that we can group organisms based on similarities and differences. In making a dichotomous key, we're keeping in mind that di means two. So for each of these questions, we're going to look at an either or choice, or a group of two. First, you need to choose 10 organisms. I find it easier if you choose 10 that are fairly different, then it's easier to compare and contrast them. You could also do one of very similar organisms, but in order to do that, you're going to have to look for maybe more subtle differences, and your knowledge of these organisms is going to have to be a little more in depth. So here are 10 organisms that I chose: grass, bumblebee, horned lizard, earthworm, pomegranate tree, lilac bush, amoeba, eagle, moose, and trout. Now, looking at this list, we're looking for similarities and differences. We can look at traits such as if it's a unicellular organism or multicellular, if it's photosynthetic or not, that being if it's an autotroph or a heterotroph, whether it has legs or not, whether there's the presence of hair or fur, whether it has wings or not, and looking at plants, whether it has stems, whether it has a trunk, or if it has herbaceous or woody stems. Looking at where the animal lives, if it lives in the water for all of its life, being aquatic, if it lives on land, being terrestrial, or both, if it's amphibious, whether it can fly or can't fly. So we can start grouping these in more than one way. For example, we could look at the amoeba here. That's going to be unicellular. Everything else is multicellular. That is, it's composed of more than one cell. So once we have a group of two, we're breaking down this larger group into smaller groups. And we could look at these here as all being plants. So we could also start looking at, from now we have this smaller group here, and we could say that these do not have legs, and that these do. And so we're breaking down these into smaller and smaller groups, and we can group them in more than one way. We could also look at, if we were doing the legs, no legs thing, to start this list another way, we can look at whether things live on land or not, since an amoeba and a trout are aquatic, or that they live in the water, and that everything else doesn't. So there's more than one way to start these out. So we can do a flow chart that can also be useful, and then make the key from there. So we can start with these yes/no questions. Is it aquatic? Yes or no? And from this, we can ask questions to further differentiate it. So our two organisms that were aquatic, we had a trout and an amoeba. So we're looking for similarities or differences between the two of those. So we could say, does it have scales? And if the answer is yes, then we have a trout. If no, then we have the amoeba. So we're going to go through and do that for each organism. So now we have those two are taken care of for this flow chart. For things that are not aquatic, now we need to look at our list again. So we still have plants kind of versus animals here. So that would be a good next question. We could ask if it's photosynthetic, being able to separate our plants from our animals. So now we had 3 different plants, right? We have grass, a pomegranate tree, and a lilac bush. If we're looking at those 3, which one is the least like the others? And again, there's more than one way you could group these things. So if we're looking at, let's say, grass versus a bush and a tree, our next question could be, does it have stems or branches? So if not, we've got grass. Yes, we still have the pomegranate tree and the lilac bush. So what are some differences between those? So they do both have flowers because the flower does eventually produce the pomegranate fruit. But if we're looking at, well, one's a tree, one's a bush, we could ask questions about that. Or we could look at, does it produce fruit? So from there, we can get our yes being the pomegranate, our no being the lilac, and so on. So we would do this for each organism and go through till we have our flowchart complete. From a complete flowchart, this is only a partial one, I realize, then we can go into making the key. So we're looking at a couple different ways we can do this. If we're starting to make a key, this is looking at kind of our first set of questions. You want an A and a B for each one. So this is where you're dichotomous. So if we're looking at our first list, looking at whether things were unicellular or multicellular, the only unicellular organism we had was an amoeba. So everything else is going to be multicellular. We're going to 2 after this. If it's photosynthetic, we're going to go to 3, and we're not real sure how many questions that's going to take us just yet. So that's blank at the moment. Similar to how we were separating things on the flow chart, we looked at whether things had stems or branches. So it's going to take us to another question. And if it doesn't, then we've got grass. So the amoeba and grass are taken care of. You can take them off of your list. So when we go to 4, we can look at whether things produce fruit, the pomegranate tree, or does not produce fruit, the lilac bush. So now everything that's linked back to this question 2, whether it's photosynthetic, we have our 3 plants taken care of, right? So now we can go back and put in a 5 here on 2B. Okay, so we need to look at the rest of our list, right? So we've got the plants and the amoeba taken care of. We're looking at things that are multicellular and not photosynthetic, right? Which should be the rest of our list. So let's go back and look. Okay, so we've taken care of those 4 with those first questions. So we could look at the legs, no legs thing now for 5. So if we're separating into has legs, does not have legs, if it has legs and we're saying go to 6, we need to look at how many things that's going to be. So we have 4, right? So now we're going to separate these guys into smaller groups. So we could look at whether things could fly, right? So the eagle and the bumblebee. We could also look at number of legs. We could say 2 legs versus 4, 4, and 6. So there's different ways we can phrase this if we're looking at number of legs or the ability to fly. So your choice there. Again, there's more than one way you can do these. Okay, so if we're looking at can fly, cannot fly, our 2 organisms that we said can fly are the bumblebee and the eagle. So now we could look at differences between them for 7. We could look at number of legs, whether it has feathers, diet, etc. So if we're looking at whether it has feathers or does not have feathers, that would be a good question. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing these questions is to stick to one characteristic rather than looking at has feathers or is an insect. We're looking at the presence or absence of feathers, right? Or we could say is an insect, is not an insect, has an exoskeleton, does not have an exoskeleton, something like that, but we want to have some consistency there. So as we start to fill this out, we can go back and fill out what number to go to. So now we're looking at things that cannot fly, but that had legs, right? We can kind of backtrack there too. Backtrack to not photosynthetic, multicellular. So we had the bumblebee and the eagle that were taken care of. Now we have the horned lizard and the moose to fill in for these next questions. So think of differences between a horned lizard or a horny toad and a moose. So for that, we could look at the presence of fur or hair, right? Which would be an easy one. There's other differences between those two organisms, obviously, so you could use that too. So now we can backtrack since we have that taken care of, and looking at that does not have legs, now we can say go to 9. Okay, so you might have to flip back to your list to remind yourself of what we have taken care of and what we don't. So we're down to the earthworm and the trout. So final questions for the differences between an earthworm and a trout. We could look at where they live. So the key here, we want to see if we first have 10 organisms, right? So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So notice that if you have 10 organisms to have a dichotomous key, you should have 9 two-part questions. So if we had 11 organisms, you should have 10 two-part questions, and so on. The key here too, to make sure this works, is if you have all of your organisms, have a list, be able to start at number 1 and get to the right place. So let's double check with earthworm. It's multicellular. We go to 2, not photosynthetic. Go to 5, does not have legs. We go to 9, is terrestrial. So that works. You would do that for each one to make sure that your key works. And so again, as you make this, you may decide you want different organisms or different questions, and that's where a flow chart is useful, as well as having a friend or someone to look over this as well. Let me know if you have questions.